The European Union and the African Union last week in Brussels concluded talks that could reset relations between the two blocs. A raft of issues ranging from security, migration, COVID-19 and trade were on the table. But could the EU merely be playing geopolitics? Terms such as mutual interest, trust and respect, synonymous with China's engagement with Africa, were used to play up the summit. Now, aware of its achievements on the continent, could the European Union be seeking to replicate China's blueprint in Africa? Or could the just concluded 6th EUAU summit be a genuine attempt at a reset? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, it was the first EUAU heads of state level meeting since 2017. Relations between the two continents have been described as imbalanced and needing an admission of past failures and a correction of current missteps. Before we get further into that discussion, let's get a recap of the summit. Here's John Bever reporting.
African leaders arrived in Brussels for the first mass meeting with their European counterparts in 5 years. There were promises of not just renewing relations, but resetting them as well.
Well, it means mutual respect, mutual recognition of what we can all bring to the party, investment in our economies, infrastructure investment, and in many ways for former colonizers to give back to the continent.
A huge amount has changed since the last AU-EU meeting in 2017. Rebuilding from the coronavirus that delayed this meeting was one of the many topics discussed. And there was a change of format, with leaders breaking into smaller groups to discuss the huge range of issues from trade and investment to security, migration and agriculture, among dozens of other topics. Financing for African projects and infrastructure underpinned many of the discussions. Brussels' so-called Global Gateway programme is widely viewed as a bid to rival China's Belt and Road Initiative and influence in Africa.
We can expect a package of at least 150 billion euros for Africa for the next 7 years. This is the first package under our Global Gateway strategy. And now we need you to tell us what the needs are and what the needs for the best for the people is.
But it was access to COVID vaccines and their production and distribution that took up much of the time and dominated a lot of the headlines. The EU were keen to highlight the roughly 140 million vaccines they've provided and the millions more promised. But while announcing a sharing of mRNA vaccine technology among 6 African countries, many AU leaders reiterated their demand for waiving intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines and highlighted the problems faced in this pandemic.
The global supply chain, as we all know, and one that we had prior depended on, failed to meet the increasing demand, and it soon became the case of the wealthiest countries having the best chance of accessing life-saving commodities. And this, if we recall history, was a case with HIV, and it was once again history repeating itself.
And at the end of it all, this, a 6-page summary of the key aims, agreements and understanding. This might be a chance to reset the links between continents, but the issue of vaccine inequality and sharing how they're made remains a stormy issue between Africa and Europe. John Beaver, CGTN, Brussels.
Well, let's now bring in our guests who've been following these developments. In Brussels, Gert Laporte, Director, European Think Tank Group, and a senior executive at the European Center for Development Policy. In Washington, D.C., Guy Demore, Senior Policy Fellow at the Center for Global Development and the former Minister of Public Works in Liberia. And in Beijing, we're joined by Victor Gao, Vice President for the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you all for being a part of this discussion. Guy Demore, if I may start off with you. Now, the current EU President, Emmanuel Macron, spoke of completely overhauling the EU-Africa relationship. Now, there generally has been an emphasis on resetting, renewing, and overhauling. First of all, why does this relationship need overhauling?
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's important to understand a little bit of the background here, that the EU hired a branding firm called Kantar to do a poll in Africa about where the EU ranks in terms of perception among Africans. And the Kantar poll came back and said that, China, the United States, France, and a distant fourth was the EU in terms of perception among Africans of who their top partners were. That, because the EU, they've always known that, their influence in Africa wasn't as high, but that sort of shook up the EU a bit. The EU hired another firm called Ogilvy. They did for $7 million. They're actually right now running a campaign on social media, on billboards across about 7 African countries, because the EU is trying to emphasize that it too is a big partner of Africa. So there's a part of that in terms of the EU seeing its influence waning in Africa and the rise of other partners insofar as the Africans are concerned. So when you think about the rebranding, the reinventing of this entire relationship, it isn't only driven by the idea that the EU wants to do better in Africa. It is driven by the perception that the EU is losing its influence in Africa and other partners are rising. That is a part of what drives this complete reinvention, because I may add, it was only 4 years ago that a new Africa-EU alliance was launched. Right, so you can't launch a new alliance every 4 years. But I think it is an exception on the part of the Europeans that they need to do something more. They need to do something more substantive, right. And that is what is driving this.
Gert Laporte, what's your view? Do you feel that the influence of the European Union is waning on the continent in Africa?
Well, first of all, I think the European Union is not very well known. And I'm working in the world of think tanks, knowledge institutes. And there's a lot of analysis done in Africa on Africa, China, Africa, Russia, Africa, France, Africa, UK. But the EU as a union of states is not fully known. While it is the most important investor, it is the most important trade partner, it is the most important development partner of Africa, even at this very moment with a very strong China that is upcoming, and also Russia and other big players, the EU is still together, the 27 member states, the strongest ally of the African continent. But the problem is that the relationship has been undergoing quite a lot of stress in the past years. You see an African continent that is becoming much more independent, that has the choice between different key players, right. Key partners. And the European Union is getting nervous about this, of course. What the European Union wants is to also move away, and Africa definitely wants this. Both partners want to move away from the traditional North-South type of relationship, where you have one partner bringing in aid money and the other partner, Africa in casu, is at the receiving end and also has to accept the conditionalities that the European Union is imposing. This is not a healthy relationship. This is not a balanced partnership. So both parties really have the intention to move towards more equality in the partnership. And this takes time. This is something which you cannot achieve that easily. And I think that's the reason why the leaders use these big words. They want to stress that this summit is the beginning of a new type of dialogue between both continents. What normally should be the case in a summit between equal partners is that you discuss each other's problems and that you find together joint solutions. And I still had the impression that we were talking a lot about Africa. African investments that need to be supported, African peace and security situations that need to be monitored. But there was not one word about Ukraine, for example. There was no discussion about some of the EU member states that have, at this moment, serious problems with rule of law, and not to mention Hungary, Poland, and others. And I think it was what the African side would have hoped for a bit more, to have a balanced, more equal type of partnership. We are moving in that direction, but it will still take time. The power balance is shifting, but very slowly.
Right. Let me rope in here, Professor Victor Gao. What do you make of the tone and the setting of this EU summit?
Well, first of all, from the Chinese perspective, we hope to see more cooperation between EU and the African countries as a whole. And EU is well positioned in terms of geography, history, and compatibility of the two economies, for example. On the other hand, I think for EU to really play a more meaningful role in Africa, several preconditions need to be met. One is that EU and its member countries need to treat African countries and African people as equal. It should be on an equal basis, rather than, for example, demonstrating or revealing any kind of sense of condescendence or lecturing down, etc. Now, secondly, EU actually does a lot of things in Africa through its member states on a country-to-country basis. Therefore, how EU can play a consolidated role in Africa, that's a technical issue that needs to be resolved, because otherwise people in Africa may just think of France or Germany or Belgium or Eastern European countries rather than EU as a whole. Now, from the Chinese perspective, we have set up a China African Development Fund, which would provide financing to all kinds of companies engaged in activities in Asia, state-owned or privately owned, or foreign invested companies with operations in Africa. This creates a unifying force for all participants from the Chinese side to participate in activities in Africa. And I hope EU can also consider setting up an EU-wide fund to finance all the economic projects done by European companies in Africa. Right. This can be a good start for EU.
All right. Gat Laporte, the talk of investment, I mean, there was the tone at the summit had a lot to do with investment. And President Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, she summed it up, though, by saying that Europe wants to be Africa's economic partner of choice. And she announced an Africa-Europe investment strategy of about 150 billion euros for Africa's connectivity through the Global Gateway Project. I mean, is the European Union, though, now replicating China's blueprint on the continent?
Well, I think you're right. To some extent, what the European Union is doing is copying, replicating what China is doing, and what China is maybe doing better. I think the Global Gateway is mainly focusing on infrastructure in all types of sectors, energy, industry, manufacturing, health sectors, education, and so on, transport. That's very good. That's what Africa needs, but that is not what I would call the distinct value of the European Union. The European Union has something more to offer, has something different to offer. And I was a little bit disappointed that this summit was not really mentioning this. Nobody would be against discussing governance issues if you do it in a more reciprocal and more balanced way than the Europeans have been doing it in the past in the relationship with Africa. But skipping this issue from the agenda is a big mistake in my view. I think there is a need to bring up issues related to state capacity building, democracy, rule of law. These are essential factors, and I had the impression that these issues were not really debated. Why? Because there is always a risk that this could lead to patronizing attitudes, as Gao said, and that should be avoided, of course. But it is an essential issue if you want to develop on both continents, not only in Africa, also, of course, in Europe. And my impression was that the European social market model of development is something that the Europeans should use more in the relationship with the rest of the world, including also the regional integration models. And this was not really happening during this summit.
Professor Victor Gao, is this more a geopolitical formation, though, design happening rather than genuine investment that needs to be put on the continent?
Indeed, I think there is a high level of suspicion that the EU's projects, including Global Gateway, is very much driven by ideological considerations. And the Global Gateway has been touted as a competition against China's focus on Africa. I hope such focus would be considered as the wrong focus. We really need to focus on what the African countries and people really care about. That is performance, delivery, really getting projects done. We should encourage a complementary role for EU, for China, for Americans, Japanese, you name it, so that they can cooperate in investments in Africa rather than competing ferociously against each other, eventually to the detriment of the African countries.
All right, gentlemen, we are going to take a short break, but do stay tuned. Talk Africa continues in a moment. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Well, Gert Laporte in Brussels, Guido Moore in Washington, D.C., and Victor Gao in Beijing, still with me here on the program. Guido, I want to continue with this question of complementarity and sincerity from the European Union. In the many years of EU-African trade, it largely remains extractive. 70% of exports from Africa to Europe are still in their raw form. Access to European markets is still quite prohibitive. You know, we've seen quotas that limit how much Africa can trade with European countries, vis-a-vis how much European countries can export to Africa. Has there been sincerity from the European side, though, in promoting trade with Africa in this many years, 22 years of EU, Africa summits?
In 1990, over 60% of African exports to the EU were unprocessed raw goods. In 2020, the most recent figures, the terms of trade still hasn't changed. And as Gert noted, every year, Africa needs to create somewhere between 12 to 15 million jobs. It is in adding value. It is in adding value to mineral, agricultural, and forest products that you create these jobs, especially through the process of industrialization. And if nothing changes about the terms of trade, then there will continue to be pressure on the thing that concerns Europe the most, African migration to Europe. Most of that migration is driven by search for economic opportunities. And so I think in this area, there is something to be learned, say, from China. At the last FOCAC meeting, China pledged a number of things. One, to buy up to $300 billion of African imports over the next 3 years. And to make that happen, there were $40 billion for different things, but most of them were trade related, so that African countries looking to export to China, African companies looking to export to China will be able to have access to trade financing to be able to add value and send it. More importantly, China also created something called grain lanes to streamline the process of African exports to China. I think there is an opportunity here for the EU to do similar things in terms of this relationship with Africa, because as long as EU policy toward Africa continues to be filtered through the lenses of migration,
right,
then it is in the EU's interest to increase the amount of jobs, and those jobs only come if the terms of trade are changed, where Africa begins to add value to its exports into the EU market.
Right. Victor Gao, let me bring you in here and get your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I would say that EU need to really care about what the African people need most. For example, manufacturing job, which is important and indispensable for the modernization of Africa as a whole. Industrialization is a must. And then in order to achieve this, you need to have higher level of education, training of skilled workers, for example. And in order to achieve that, you need to have the overall environment of peace and stability, and also good governance at the government level, at lower government level, you name it. So I think what Africa needs is a very comprehensive, overarching package of things. And then EU definitely has its role to play. And I just hope China, EU members, and other major players, etc., will cooperate rather than blindly compete with each other. And eventually, we need to really get the view of the African countries and people. What do they need the most? And what's the development direction that they want to set for their own people? This will be very important for EU in particular because of the bad colonial legacies in their relations with Africa as a whole. They need to really overcome that bad legacy in order to convince people in Africa that what EU package spells out is for the Africans' own benefit, rather than, for example, a surprise or a competition or ideological geopolitical package aimed at competing with someone else outside of Africa.
All right. Let me look at very briefly on how partners are coming in to help Africa. And Gert Leopold, you know, the EU remains quite adamant on waiving the mRNA patents, but have agreed to transfer technology, you know, to some 6 African countries. Of course, not everybody is particularly happy about this, particularly recollecting what happened during the COVID period when African countries could not get access to vaccines. So what do you make of all this?
Well, I think in the first place, I think the European Union has been acting in the eyes of many Africans too little, too late. It is true that the European Union is probably at this moment the most generous provider of vaccines to Africa, 450 million vaccines. Europe also contributed significantly with 3 billion euros to the COVAX facility, which also stands equal to something like 400 million vaccines. But all this has gone unnoticed. Why? Because the European Union is a terribly poor and bad communicator. So it's much more difficult for the European Union to get its act together. And that also explains why many of the efforts of the Europeans have gone unnoticed by the African side. But of course, Europe could have done much better. And the travel ban to Southern Africa in December because of the Omicron variant was a very bad example of partnership. The Europeans should have called Ramaphosa, should have consulted with the South Africans who discovered the Omicron at their level while it was probably already in the European Union itself. We should have had a real dialogue on this, and this did not happen. And that is something where the Europeans have a major problem of communication and of perception. And of course, on the vaccines and the intellectual property rights, also there, the European Union could do more to temporarily waive these intellectual property rights, because that would be a very important symbolic gesture. The summit has made some openings to discuss this, so let's see what will come out of that in the next months. And whether the Europeans will be able to convince the African side of their seriousness on waiving the patents.
Right. I want to get your winding up comments, gentlemen. And Gudemore, let me start off with you here. You know, reflecting on these African EU summit, you know, the 6th one since going back 22 years ago. What is your takeaway? What is, you know, this new partnership or significant policy commitments that you will see unfolding over time?
First, I should say that, you know, the value of a relationship, especially in diplomacy, is usually, you can verify that through the quality of high-level exchanges. And we have seen EU leaders, we have seen EU member states prime ministers, presidents coming to the continent more and more. We have seen from the EU side a real concerted effort, not only to improve its image in the eyes of ordinary Africans, but to actually increase the substance of what the EU does in Africa. And I think that's a really, really good thing. I think it's important to also understand that the EU and Africa are having two opposite problems. In Africa, you have a population that is growing and is continuing to set to grow and be very young. In the EU, you have a population that has stabilized, is aging, and is declining. In the end, because the EU and Africa are so close to each other, EU is going to need African labor, and as Africa needs more jobs. The more we can recognize this reality and begin to work toward that, I think it's better for the two neighbors in the EU and Africa. And one hopes that what we saw at this sixth summit is the beginning of a more meaningful partnership and the fulfillment of commitments that have been made between the EU and Africa in the past.
Gert Laporte?
Well, I think we are making progress, but we are definitely not yet there. There's still a lot of work to be done. But I see at least that there is a dialogue that is becoming more balanced between the two parties. I definitely would not like to talk now of equal partnership. You still see that the European side is still the dominant force in the partnership. But when the declaration of this summit was prepared, there was a lot of input from the African side, and that was very positive. And I think it would be good if Africa would also reflect on its strategy vis-à-vis the European Union. And the European Union is sometimes said to have produced too many strategies with Africa or towards Africa, while on the African side we have Agenda 2063, but there is not a specific type of strategy of the African Union vis-à-vis the European Union, and that would be very helpful also for future meetings. But beyond the heads of state, where I'm more positive and even very positive is that I see that the beating heart of the Europe-Africa relationship is much more with the youth, with the young people, with the small and medium enterprises, with my types of think tank communities. We've never worked so well together with the African think tank community as in the preparation of this summit. So there's a lot of interaction happening beyond the formal high-level settings. And this is what we should capture more. This is what we should integrate more in the discussions, because that's at the end the beating heart of this Africa-Europe relationship.
All right, Victor Gao, you have the final word.
Thank you very much. I think Africa is really the future of mankind, and there are lots of talents, a lot of skilled laborers in Africa, and their values and potentials are yet to be fully emancipated. And in this regard, for EU to have a meaningful role to play will be very important for African countries and people. And from the Chinese perspective, we just hope China and EU can cooperate more rather than having this relationship as structured as a competition relationship, because eventually we all need to agree that the taste of the pudding is in eating it. We need to let the African countries and people decide what exactly investments they need and the format of the cooperation between EU and China and other major participants in this investment in EU. And hopefully Africa can really fully emancipate its potentials and values in the coming years and decades.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for being in this discussion. Very insightful indeed. But we'll leave it there this week on Talk Africa. I'd like to thank our guests for their insightful analysis. Gert Laporte in Brussels, Director of the European Think Tank Group. Guy Demore in Washington, D.C., a Senior Policy Fellow with the Center for Global Development. And Victor Gao in Beijing, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you too for tuning in to Talk Africa. And remember, you can engage us further on this subject through our social media handles on Twitter and Facebook, displaying on your screen right now. And also catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. See you again next time. From the team and me, goodbye.